recall that in my opening speech I laid out those two contentions that Mike and I would defend this evening. The first of these was that the texts of the New Testament teach that Jesus' resurrection was a physical, historical event. Now, Dr. Wolfmagan says that we could interpret this another way, though he's not claiming that we should. But it seems that both of our colleagues have difficulty engaging with the topic this evening. The topic this evening is how should we interpret the texts of the New Testament concerning Jesus' resurrection. And I would certainly admit you could interpret these texts mythologically, but the problem is that if you did so, you would be wrong, because that's not the proper interpretation of the text. Dr. Wolfmagan thinks that the Gospels are examples of mythological writing akin to the stories of Greco-Roman mythology, and therefore to be understood symbolically. Unfortunately, I'm sorry to say Dr. Wolfmagan's scholarship here is just hopelessly out of date. He would have us ignore over 100 years of historical scholarship with respect to the New Testament and revert to the mythological interpretation of the 19th century. In particular, he would have us completely ignore the Jewish reclamation of Jesus and revert to understanding Jesus against the backdrop of pagan religion. He fails to grasp the Jewishness of Jesus and so seriously distorts the meaning of these very Jewish texts. Not only so, but the fact that the Gospels were written so soon after the events that they record makes them utterly unlike myths, which form over centuries of development. Paul Barnett, who is an Australian historian, sums it up well when he says, "The Jewish character of the gospel message and the radical brevity of the time frame in which it arose are the two torpedoes that sink the mythological reconstruction." More specifically, I think Dr. Wolfmagan has got the literary genre of the Gospels wrong. C.S. Lewis, a professor of medieval and Renaissance literature at Cambridge University, wrote, "I have been reading romances, legends, myths all my life. I know what they are like. I know that not one of them is like this." The Gospels are not of the genre of mythology. They are historical records of people who really lived, of events that really occurred, of places that actually existed, that you can read about in the works of historians like Josephus, the Jewish historian. Rather, contemporary scholars have come to recognize that the Gospels belong to the literary genre of ancient biography, akin to the so-called lives of famous people. According to the New Testament scholar Craig Keener, all four Gospels fit the genre of ancient biography, the life of a prominent person. Moreover, he points out, biographies were essentially historical works. He says the fact that the Gospels use recent traditions and that those who can be checked are careful in their use of sources suggests that the Gospels should be placed among the most reliable of ancient biographies. So why does Dr. Wolfmagan think that the Gospels belong to the genre of myth? Well, the basic reason is philosophical naturalism. As he says, he agrees with Tillich that God is just the ground of all being, an impersonal absolute. So anything that relates supernatural events are for him, by definition, mythological. His claim is thus not based upon a careful, comparative, literary analysis of the gospel text. Rather, his naturalism has led him into a disastrous misunderstanding of the Gospel's literary genre. So I think when we read the Gospels in their Jewish setting, their Jewishness emerges. They are ancient Jewish biographies of this man, Jesus. And as I pointed out, they affirm consistently the honorable burial, the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances, and the very origin of the disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection. Now, Dr. Wolfmagan says the burial is not historical. Joseph of Arimathea is a later addition. Let me just quickly list some of the reasons for thinking that this is historical. First, Jesus' burial is multiply attested in independent early sources, like the pre-Markan Passion source, the source behind the Gospel of Matthew, the independent source behind the Gospel of Luke, 1 Corinthians 15, and the tradition that Paul quotes that goes back to within 5 years of the death of Jesus, and the sermons in the book of Acts, which record the early apostolic preaching. So, according to Paul Barnett, and I quote, careful comparison of the texts of Mark and John indicate that neither of these Gospels is dependent on the other, and yet they have a number of incidents in common. For example, the burial of Jesus in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. Indeed, we have about 5 independent early sources for Joseph. What about the empty tomb? Well, let me again just list some of the grounds for affirming its historicity. Number 1, the historicity of the burial story implies the historicity of the empty tomb. If the site of Jesus' grave were known in Jerusalem to Jew and Christian alike, then a movement founded on belief in the resurrection of the dead man could never have arisen and flourished in Jerusalem in the face of the enemies of that movement. They could have simply pointed to the tomb of Jesus, the occupied grave, to snuff Christianity in the bud. Secondly, the empty tomb story is also multiply attested in independent early sources. It's in the pre-Markan Passion source, it's in the sources independently behind Matthew and Luke, it's in the Gospel of John, it's implied by Paul's tradition in 1 Corinthians 15, and it's also referred to in the early apostolic sermons in the book of Acts. Thirdly, the tomb was probably discovered empty by women. In first century Palestinian Jewish society, the testimony of women was regarded as virtually worthless. Women were not credible witnesses. Therefore, any later legendary account would have made male disciples discover the empty tomb, Peter and John. The fact that it is women whose testimony was worthless in that culture, who are the witnesses to the fact of the empty tomb, is best explained by the fact that, like it or not, they were the discoverers of the empty tomb in the Gospel. Writers faithful to record what for them was a rather embarrassing and awkward fact. So by the criterion of embarrassment, the historicity of the discovery of the empty tomb by women is likely historical. Fourthly, the story is simple and lacks theological embellishment. If you want to see how real legends look, just look at the apocryphal Gospel of Peter, a forgery from the second half of the 2nd century after Christ, in which Christ comes out of the tomb as a giant whose head reaches above the clouds, supported by 2 giant angels, followed by a talking cross and heralded by a voice from heaven. By contrast, the Markan narrative is stark in its simplicity. For these and many other reasons, the vast majority of New Testament historians have concluded that not only the burial, but also the empty tomb is historical. What authority does Dr. Volmernans offer? On behalf of his claim that it is legendary, he appeals to Randall Helms, who is a retired English professor from Arizona State University. Not, I think, a credible source. As for the appearances, these are universally acknowledged by New Testament historians, as well as the origin of the disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection. On all these grounds, then, I think we have good reason for thinking that the New Testament texts are reliable in what they teach about the resurrection of Jesus.